I believe in starting on time, and it's 8:30, so we're going to start. And those who will come later will join us. Well, first of all, welcome. Good to see everybody here. This is a strange class. When I was a younger fellow, I had two goals in life. One was to become a professor of English literature, and the secondary goal that came up later in my life was to become a rabbi. So I'm always a split personality, a rabbi literature person. And I always try to combine those two interests. So this class actually does combine those two interests. People that were significant as literary individuals, but who had something to say that relate to religion in general, and that actually have something to connect to Judaism in particular. Let me give a little bit of background. One of my favorite authors from the 19th century was Matthew Arnold. We'll discuss Matthew Arnold in the future classes. But Matthew Arnold was a big proponent of what he called culture. And culture, good morning, culture he defined as studying or knowing the best that has been thought and said among human beings. His idea was, you know, each of us is smart, each of us has his own and her own background and traditions. However, there's a whole world of people out there from different continents, different eras, different ways of looking at life. And they've also said important things. And Matthew Arnold believed that in order to be a cultured human being, one has to be open-minded. One has to be able to have the humility to realize that other people have wisdom also. Let me give this, how this applies to religion. It applies yes and it applies no. Let me give an example, a stark example how it doesn't apply. There's a legend, it's not historically proven, but there's a legend that in the year 640, the Muslims conquered Alexandria in Egypt. And Alexandria had the greatest library in the world. And the soldiers who conquered Alexandria, they asked the Caliph Omar, what should we do with this library? He said, burn it down. Burn it down. This has all the wisdom of the world in it. It has the biggest collection of the whole world. Famous library. He says, well, here's the point. If the material in that library disagrees with the Quran, we should burn it. And if it agrees with the Quran, who needs it? Burn the library down. And so they burnt the library down. That's a legend. We don't know if that's historically happened. But it's a mentality. It's a religious mentality that says, I have the truth. The truth with capital T. And because I have the truth, I don't need anybody else's truth. Why should I confuse myself with other people's thoughts, other people's traditions, other people's criticisms? All it can do is confuse me.
Oh, off the 117.
Please, everybody mute your own things, all right? So that we don't have side noises.
And of course, I couldn't sleep, so I was up for 2 hours.
If you all mute your things, that'll be very good. Anyway.
To that and to the other stuff.
Anyway.
All
right, to continue. So the one point of religion is, since I have the truth, I don't need to hear anybody else's truth. That's one point of view. The other point of view is, since we are religious and we believe that God created the world, we're human beings. We're not just Jews. I'm talking about Judaism now. We're not just Jews, we're also human beings. And everything in the world belongs to us as well as any other human being. So science, art, music, literature, all those things are just as much part of our tradition as human beings as anybody else. And therefore, in order to be complete in our religious tradition, in our religious worldview, please mute your, but everyone please mute your things. Lawrence.
No, we don't have any boots. I have the boots right upstairs.
Rhonda, are you online? Rhonda?
Yes, I'm here, but I'm not a host. If you make me a host, I can mute people.
How do I make you a host?
You hover over my name in the participants list.
I don't see your list.
Okay, so if you look at the bottom of Zoom, there's a button that says participants.
Yeah.
Click on that.
Yeah.
And then you find me on the list on the right.
Yeah.
And then I think you click on my name, and I think you can make me a host.
How do I make you a host?
Click on my name, or maybe there's a more next to my name.
Make host. Just like I see it.
Yeah, make me a host, and I will mute people who are not muted.
Okay, you're a host.
Okay.
Okay. All right, you're okay? Okay, let's continue. I'm sorry for the interruption. Okay. Anyway, let's continue. So in case of Judaism, we have two different kinds of philosophies. One philosophy is we have the truth. So since we have the truth, we don't need anybody else's truth. And therefore, let's shut out all other knowledge. All it is confusion. It's like the Caliph Omar. If it agrees with Judaism, we don't need it. We already have it. If it doesn't agree with Judaism, burn it. That's the philosophy. The other philosophy is, since we're human beings and since we're interested in the universe at large, and since we want our religious viewpoint to be full, whole, wholesome, and healthy and wholesome, it's important for us to at least know what's going on outside. And those things which are incorporatable in Judaism, good. And those things which are not, we should have the intellectual ability to sift out those things which are not relevant and which are harmful and continue that way accordingly. So these are the two philosophies. Obviously, my philosophy is the second philosophy. Today, we're going to deal with a man named Ralph Waldo Emerson. But before we get to Emerson, I want to talk about the change in the way people thought given the modern period. Until, let's say, the 1700s even early, let's say 1600s even, God was a given. Whether you were Jewish or Christian or Muslim, whatever you were in the world, or Buddhist, wherever you were, God was a given. You might have agreements or disagreements with God, but God was a given. Starting with Spinoza, but not just Spinoza, but Spinoza and thereafter, people had a spirit of inquiry. They started questioning things. Not Spinoza believed in God, in his own kind of God, but there became a different way of thinking. People started having what we might call a more critical point of view. Before that, when you wanted to know the truth, you went to the rabbi or to the priest or whoever it was, and the rabbi and the priest knew the truth. You asked the question and they gave you the answer. That was the end of the discussion. Starting in the 1600s, 1700s, this was not so clear anymore. There still were people who had the narrow group where the rabbi or the priest had the truth, but you also had many people who were starting to think more broadly. They wanted a religion or a religious point of view that was more, I would call the grand religious view. So this started, let's say, with Isaac Newton, who lived 1643 to 1727. So Newton kind of put the world, the physical world, on a scientific basis, but it wasn't just scientific basis, it was a scientific way of thinking. The way of thinking basically said, we can observe with our eyes certain things. We can use mathematics to calculate certain things. The world is an organized system. God, in his infinite wisdom, created the world in an intelligent way. And the human being has a mind, has intelligence, has reason. And through our reason, we can discover God's creations by learning the laws of science. There are certain physical laws of science that once we get them down, we get to understand God better. Newton was himself a religious man. But the way we think is already something different. It means if I can see it, if I can prove it, then I know it's there. And if it's metaphysical, means beyond what I can prove by physics, then already I wonder, is it true or is it false? Is it my idea correct? Is it not correct? If it can't be proven, maybe it's not really so. So this was the beginning of a twist in human thinking. During the 19th century, especially in Germany, there were a number of thinkers who started rethinking their own religion. So the most famous theologian, Protestant theologian at the time, was a man named Friedrich Schleiermacher. I never read Schleiermacher, I don't read German, but I read about Schleiermacher. So this is secondhand. But Schleiermacher basically said, what's true in religion isn't that God commanded us to do such and such. The truth of religion isn't coming from the outside. The truth of religion comes from inside. So before Schleiermacher, there was an idea that religion was heteronymous. Heteronymous means there's a big God out there, and God commands us to do this or not to do that. And basically, we are subservient, and our religious truth is, how do we get into contact with this outside God? Schleiermacher emphasized not a heteronymous God, but an autonomous God. How can we prove religion? We prove religion from ourselves. How do we feel? Our instincts, our emotion. God comes out of us. Not that we look at the heavens and discover God, but we look into our own selves and see our spiritual nature. And so he basically put Christianity, Protestantism, on a different footing. When he looked at the Bible wasn't some outside God giving wisdom, giving truth, giving commandments, but it was basically a reflection of human searching for spiritual connection. And he saw, for example, Havdil, Jesus was not as a divine person, a divine being, but as an ideal human being who internally understood God, and that he's a model for Christians to follow, not because there's an outside God that commanded, but because there's an example of an individual who, through his own personal spirituality, was able to connect with God. Then also within 19th century Germany, you had Julius Wellhausen, who was from 1844 to 1918. Wellhausen was a kind of the founder of so-called biblical criticism. What is biblical criticism? It means we generally, before this time, we believe that God gave the Bible. Every word in the Bible is holy, sacred. This comes from God. You can't argue with God. Wellhausen said, you know what? The Bible isn't from God at all. It's from human beings. And not only one human being, but there was a group of human beings that wrote over different periods of time. Some were more gifted, some were less gifted. It's a text that should be studied like you study Shakespeare. You could analyze the text and you could criticize the text. It's not a holy sacred text that stands above and beyond human criticism. So these things started to set a different way of thinking in modern times. They challenged our way of thinking. We want a scientific method. We want to be able to prove something. Religion should become not from outside God to us. It comes from an inside understanding, inside spirituality. And finally, the Bible, although it may have wonderful things to say, is a human document, not a divine document. Well, these are major shakes in the human, or certainly in the Jewish and Christian world, but that affected the Western world dramatically. Now, let's just reflect a moment before I get to Emerson. In the Jewish world, there were different ways of responding to this kind of change in the outside world. The Jews, even though we lived in ghettos, and even though many Jews were closed off, there were many Jews who weren't closed off. In Europe and Germany, Jews were getting more cultured, and they were learning, had access to general knowledge. And even in the small communities and ghettos in the Eastern Europe or in North Africa, wherever there is, ideas have a way of seeping in. And it started to affect the way people were thinking, even traditionalists. So just as there was on the one hand, an impulse to broaden religion, broaden our knowledge, there was also an impulse to protect the tradition. And how do you protect the tradition? You shut out everything from the outside. So I'm going to quote to you from Chaim Nachman Bialik, who was one of the great Hebrew poets of the modern period. Here's what he described religious life in Eastern Europe. This is a quotation in English translation. Halacha has an angry face, strict, severe, hard as steel, strict justice. It sets forth its ruling and leaves no room for differentiation. Its yes is yes, its no is no. Fossilized piety, obligation, enslavement. People are starting to think, and they look at our system, and who's in charge? Rabbis, old-time rabbis with long beards, who say, do this, don't do that. Why? God says so. How do I know God said so? You're questioning me? I'm the rabbi. I know, I say Torah, I got it from my rabbi, I got it from his rabbi, all the way to Moses. You have to listen to me. Oh my goodness. So Judaism became, in many sects, many parts of Judaism, became like the Caliph Omar. We have the truth, and you have to accept the truth. Anything on the outside, burn it. We're not interested. And who's in charge of the truth? The rabbi, the priests, because they're the ones who have the knowledge. And they claim to have it from their teachers all the way going back to the beginning. And we're going to skip a little bit with that little bit of a background. We're going to skip to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson lived from 1803 to 1882, very interesting character. If you've read his writings, you're very fortunate. If you haven't read them, you should. He's a very powerful writer. I first read his essay, Self-Reliance, as a 9th grader in Sharpless Junior High School in Seattle, Washington. And I remember as a 9th grader reading that essay, it jarred me and jostled me. It was such a powerful essay. I'll come back to it in a moment. But Emerson had a notion, similar to what we've been talking about before, that truth has to be established by each individual. There is some truth, maybe with a capital T out there, but it's not coming from God. There's not some external source that's giving us the truth. Rather, the truth is rather a small t, and each one of us is going to find his and her own kind of truth. Now, he started off life as a minister in a religion, and he was teaching. He was in a Protestant church in Massachusetts, And at some point he realized he didn't believe in it anymore. Not that he didn't believe in Christianity. He didn't give up on Christianity, but he didn't believe in the system. So for example, in the church, they used to have bread and wine, and they believed that this was somehow a representation of of Jesus. They're eating the flesh and blood of Jesus. I'm not sure in the Protestant church if they took it so literally, but in his church, they had this right. And at some point he gave a sermon and he said, ladies and gentlemen, I can't be your minister anymore. I just don't believe in this anymore. If it's symbolic, okay. But this is a practice which isn't relevant to modern people anymore. Maybe 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, people could identify with this. They could believe this. But today, we have science, we have nature, we have a way of thinking. This stuff just isn't relevant. And then he resigned his position. In June 1832, he says as follows. This is a quotation from Emerson. I have sometimes thought that in order to be a good minister, it was necessary to leave the ministry. It's a good message for rabbis also, by the way. The profession is antiquated. In an altered age, we worship in the dead forms of our forefathers. What was his problem? His problem is a problem that faces all moderns who are open to the outside world, including rabbis, including any religious Jew today, certainly a modern Jew today. We go to synagogue, Christians go to church, or Muslims go to mosque, wherever they go, and they're praying not from their own hearts per se. They're praying the words that were written thousands of years ago, or hundreds and hundreds of years ago, by other people in other situations who had a whole different worldview. Every morning we say, God creates the world all over again. And we say that God takes the sun out of the window of the sky and moves the sun across the sky. We know that isn't true anymore. So for us, we're such smart people. We say it's poetic. Even in the non-Jews, we say sunrise and sunset. We still use these old images. But in our brain, way down inside, we say, you know what? We're praying old forms that were developed by people thousands of years ago. And if we were starting from scratch right now, would we make our synagogues just like they are now? Would we have the same prayers? Would we follow the same traditions? What would we do? So we have to reevaluate. So how did Emerson reevaluate? He started off with nature. In his essay, Nature, he says, I'm quoting Emerson now, our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchers of the fathers. In other words, we look backwards. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face. We, though, face it through their eyes. In other words, do we have a direct connection with God? Or is our connection really because our ancestors, we say at the beginning of our prayers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob understood God, and we, because of them, we kind of vicariously go to God that way. Emerson is saying religion, he's talking about Christianity, but it equally applies to Judaism. Our whole framework is then, the past. He says, why should not we also enjoy an original relationship with the universe? Why should not we have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs? And just let's think about it a moment. He wants a revelation of religion to us and not the history of theirs. So when we say revelation, what do we think of? Our ancestors were at Mount Sinai. Our prophets received insights from God. The Torah was divinely inspired by God. God gave revelation to our ancestors. Okay, those are all wonderful things. But what about us? Is our religion based only on the past revelation, or does God still live today? Emerson said, why do preachers say, and God spoke? Why don't they say, and God speaks? And why don't they interpret the religious feeling in terms of our own current feelings, not just how our ancestors thought and ancestors felt? And as I say, the American scholar, he gave a speech, the American scholar, to the Phi Beta Kappa people. And he said, in the right state, a scholar is a man thinking. And we could say a man or woman thinking. What does he mean by that? He means each of us is supposed to think. It's not we don't put our brains on neutral and or an idle. We just take whatever we learned from the past, we just take and spoon over to the next generation. We're supposed to process everything. We're supposed to be thinking about everything. He said, in a degenerate state, when the victim of society, a person tends to become a mere thinker, or still worse, the parrot of other men's thinking. Now, I'm sure that you all go to wonderful synagogues and hear great sermons from many people, including me. I'm not a rabbi in synagogue anymore. But what you'll often hear is the rabbi or the preacher talking about what some great sage then told us. Very, very rarely, at least in my experience, except for when I speak, of course, very rarely do people give their own opinion on anything. And then if they give their own opinion, people say, prove it. Who said that first? I remember once years ago, I gave a lecture after my mother died. I wrote a book called The Orphaned Adult. And I gave a lecture to, it was a mixed group, Jews and non-Jews. And one of the members of the audience was an Orthodox rabbi. And I was talking about the experience of an adult person who loses a parent. So after my lecture, which was a very nice lecture, people asked questions. And this particular rabbi raised his hand and he says, what's a halachic source for your speech? I said, what? Do I need a halachic source for my speech? I'm telling you how I felt. I'm telling you what happened. He says, it's not relevant. Not relevant. That's what our problem is. That's what Emerson was talking about. Man thinking. I have experience. I have a valid experience. I know what I saw. I know how I felt. But the person says, just a second. I want to be the parrot of other men's thinking. Instead of feeling the freedom to speak out on one's own, one feels I'm only allowed to say something if someone before me, authoritative, said it first. He says, meek young men grow up in libraries, believing it their duty to accept the views which Cicero, which Locke, which Bacon have given, forgetful that Cicero, Locke, and Bacon were also young men in libraries where they wrote those books. In other words, I'm also a thinking person. Okay, so Cicero said that, and Moses said that, and Rabbi so-and-so said it. All these great sages said things. That was wonderful. But you know what? They were just the same as I am. They were also young people looking for truth. Okay, now through the course of centuries, I realize that they said important things that are worthwhile for me to learn also. But that doesn't negate my own ability to think and to formulate my own ideas. So he says, instead of man thinking, we have the bookworm. I'm going to tell you something very strange. In the last issue of the Jewish Press newspaper, which is a newspaper that basically goes to Orthodox audience, mostly to the right-wing Orthodox, they have a bi-weekly column when they ask 4 rabbis a question. And I don't know how I got into it, but I'm one of the 4 rabbis. I'm off the charts for them. I'm going to just tell you the actual question they asked. Should a frum Jew, means a religious Jew, should a frum Jew believe that the sun goes around the earth if the Rambam says it does? Now, when they asked me that question, I said, what an absurd question. We all know that the Rambam lived in the Middle Ages. The Rambam was a scientist. He was a doctor. He was an intellectual. He was a philosopher. And of course, the Rambam will always follow the science of his day. So therefore, there's no question at all. There's no question at all that Rambam, who's a reasonable person, realizes that science advances. And if he was going to write the same book today, he would use modern astronomy. He wouldn't use the Ptolemaic astronomy. There's no question about it at all. And that's what I wrote. At the end of my comment, I said, one of the great dangers for religion and for human progress in general is for people to cling to discredited theories and outdated knowledge. Those who cast reason behind thereby cast truth behind, and truth is a seal of the Almighty. Brilliant words. Now, that's my answer, which I took for granted. The next person answered, I think it makes more sense to side with Rambam than it does with Copernicus. What? I think it makes more, this is a quotation of a rabbi, knowledgeable rabbi. I think it makes more sense to side with Rambam than it does with Copernicus. Is this man thinking? Or this man without thinking? Is this the bookworm? In other words, there's a great authority, Maimonides. He says such and such. Who am I, little me? Who could I argue with Rambam? If Rambam says it, it has to be true. The rabbi who answered after that, he didn't want to say that Rambam was right or Rambam was wrong. He said Rambam was just writing from his point of view. from the point of human beings. But he didn't say that the Rambam would, of course, negate that point of view if he was alive now. And the third person besides me who answered, who is himself very highly educated, college educated, very, very brilliant guy, he said, it's likely that the Rambam would agree with modern science. Likely? It's unlikely. It's absolutely for sure. What's going on here? What's going on here is that we are afraid to think. Religion has become afraid to think. What happens is we have authorities, Rambam, Rashi, Vilna Gaon, whoever we have. And because those people said something, who am I, little me, to contradict them? That kind of thinking, ladies and gentlemen, is the death of religion, death of a living religion. That becomes a fossilized religion. That's what people are scared of. So of course, if you live in the bubble, then you can accept that and you could burn all the books on the outside. There is no other truth. But if you're a thinking person, you can't live with that. Religion cannot be that way. So you simply cannot base your religion on shutting your own brain off. And once we ask people to shut off their brains, that's the beginning of the death of a living religion. And this is what Emerson was saying already in the early 1800s. He said, instead of man thinking, we have a bookworm. Hence the book-learned class who value books as such, not as related to nature and the human constitution, but as making a sort of third estate with the world and the soul. People want to know the truth? Well, let's look in the books and see what the books say. I say this often when it comes to halakhic matters. I say there are two kinds of poskim, two kinds of rabbinic halakhic decisors. One time you ask them a question and they look at the book. What does the book say? That's one answer. The other kind, which I think is the correct posek, looks in the person's eyes. Why are you asking me this question? How will my answer impact on your life? What does this have to do with God? What does it have to do with the way you're going to organize your life and relate to the Almighty based on my answer? That's the correct posek. The correct posek is, then you look at the books. Of course, you have to know. I mean, I'm not saying you should be ignorant. We should know what the sources are. But the ultimate decision shouldn't be made by books. It should be made by us. I remember when I was president of the Rabbinical Council of America years ago. So we were discussing the brains. We developed a policy to consider brainstem death. I don't want to go into the whole issue today, but that was our issue. We passed a resolution on that, and it allowed organ transplants. So there was a big discussion among the RCA rabbis. We finally passed that, but one of the great rabbis of the group, probably one of the most important post-scheme type of the Rabbinical Council of America, came out strongly against us. Why? Because there's a teshuvah in some rabbi in the 18th century who says that death is defined by the heart pumping, by breathing. He brought a pasuk to prove that life is defined by breathing. And even though the person is just breathing by a ventilator, that's still breathing. So I asked the person, I said, when you bring a source from a rabbi from the 18th century, he had no concept of what a ventilator is. He brings a proof from a pasuk. He didn't bring any proof from any scientific study that he went to talk to doctors about death. Well, how is that relevant to our discussion? And the answer was, you're speaking against the Godel? You're speaking against this rabbi? I'm not speaking against that rabbi. I'm just saying within the context of what he knew, he answered the best he could. But why is that relevant to us today? The situation is radically different today. We have to base ourselves on modern science and modern knowledge and modern technology. The rabbi thought I was out of my mind. That's the difference between man thinking and the bookworm. There are books, and there you can find sources for almost anything and any opinion you want. But man thinking means we have to process that, apply it, see how it works. Emerson, in his discussion in the American Scholar, he speaks of the education of the scholar by nature. And as we should study nature. He was very big in nature. And by books. Doesn't mean we shouldn't read. Of course we should read. But then also by action. He said a scholar doesn't just have ideas and sitting in the library. A scholar means a thinking person tries to take those ideas and apply them to a better society. And he says as follows: we will walk on our own feet. We will work with our own hands. We will speak with our own minds. A nation of men will, for the first time, exists because each believes himself inspired by the divine soul, which also inspires all men. We believe God created us. God also created our minds. God gave us the power to think. God gave us the power to research. God gave us a chance to be individualistic. Now, I agree that Emerson takes things to a pretty far extreme and somewhat diminishes the role of tradition and history. We have to balance these things. But Emerson was an extremely important corrective. And I think he's still a corrective today and still should be read today. He spoke at a Harvard Divinity School in 1838. He made a revolutionary speech. It's called the famous Divinity School Address. And he's speaking to people who themselves are going to become ministers. He says, this is a quotation, "That is always best which gives me to myself. The sublime is excited in me by the great stoical doctrine, obey thyself. That which shows God in me fortifies me. That which shows God out of me makes me a wart and a wen." Very strong language. He's telling his divinities, I would like to say, telling the Smicha students who are graduating from Smicha now, you know what? You're becoming rabbis? You're responsible now. You have to think for yourselves, folks. It's not what your Rebbe said and your great Rebbe and your great Rebbe said. You are responsible to make decisions. Obey yourself. Have confidence in yourself. Think carefully. It doesn't mean you ignore all the traditions. It doesn't mean you ignore all the sources. No, I don't. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it means based on thorough knowledge, ultimately the decision has to be yours. Obey yourself. If you don't obey yourself, you're a liar and a hypocrite and a fake. That which shows God out of me makes me a wart and a wen. I can't think of God up in heaven far away from me. I've got to be able to realize God is also within me. God gave me the power to think and to feel and to. He says, let me admonish you, first of all, to go alone, to refuse the good models, even the most sacred, in the imagination of men, and dare to love God without mediator or veil. The imitator dooms himself to hopeless mediocrity. Whoa. Whoa. I think modern day religion, whatever religion, I'm not going to comment only on orthodoxy, but when you have people who are imitating, who are living only because that's what people did, only because that's what we're supposed to do, you're dooming yourself to hopeless mediocrity. It doesn't mean we should ignore those things. I'm not saying that. I want to emphasize that. There are traditions which give us strength. There are traditions which give us a way of living which is meaningful and which is helpful and which is structured. These are good things. But we have to take them with understanding, not by rote, not without thinking. His famous essay, Self-Reliance, which I read in 9th grade and I've read many times since then, and here's what he says. There is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, that he must take himself for better or for worse as his portion. Though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him, but through his toil bestowed on that plot of ground, which is given to him to fill. Each of us has certain talents. Each of us has a certain context. Each of us has certain strengths and weaknesses. We can't be anything other than what we are. The idea is not to figure out, how could I be like so-and-so? How could I change my life like, no. God says, what can I do best? What talents did God give me, specifically me, that I can use best to develop myself in a way which will be better for humanity also? Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. What does it mean, nonconformist? It doesn't mean we all have to be hippies. It doesn't mean you should do crazy things just to do crazy things. He didn't mean that. He meant you have to have the integrity of thinking for yourself. It means if everyone in the world was wearing a red sweater, and I also wear a red sweater, that doesn't make me a conformist. It looks like I'm conforming, but it doesn't mean I'm conforming. Nonconformism is a way of thinking. It means I'm wearing this red sweater, not because everyone else is wearing it. I couldn't care less what they're wearing. I'm wearing a red sweater. I like red sweaters, assuming that's true. There's a fine line. It's very easy for us to copy other people than to think it's our own. I don't say no. But Emerson is asking us to be ourselves, have confidence in ourselves and to trust ourselves. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. I am ashamed to think how easily we capitulate to badges and names, to large societies and dead institutions. This is happening today. I've listened to this opinion. Well, who are you relying on? Who's your authority? Myself. This is what I came up to. You don't matter. I need an authority. I need someone greater than you. I need a historical figure who has a better name, a more established name than you have. So he says, man is timid and apologetic. He is no longer upright. He dares not say, I think, I am, but he quotes some saint or sage. I often am on different rabbis' lists and chats and all that. And the simplest question, which should require no particular genius to answer, the rabbis online that I'm getting emails from, they all have to quote 10 sources before they can give their opinion. So-and-so says this, so-and-so says that. Blah, blah, blah. Just a second. I don't care what all those people said. Let's just look at the facts. What's the question? What are the implications of the question? How does it fit into our overall halakhic structure? And making a decision, make an opinion. I remember years ago, I was a scholar in residence in some community, and the rabbi, it's a community with people with some more observant, less observant Jews. And they had dinner for Friday night, and after dinner they were serving tea. So the rabbi got up and said, here, when you make the tea, first take hot water out of the urn into one cup, then pour the cup into another cup, then take that cup and pour it into another cup, then you put the tea bag into it. Okay, we all know, cliché, cliché. Now, let's just say you weren't an expert in halakhic literature, and someone told you that. What would you think? You think the guy's an idiot, pardon the expression. This is moronic. If you're going to make tea, make tea. If you're not going to make tea, don't make tea. But you if you pour in 3 different cups, the water's still hot. How do you define cooking? So you can make a whole diuk and an explanation. Well, in the first cup, what comes out of the urn is very hot, and the second cup is very less hot. But you know what? This is hair splitting. This is hair splitting. I'm not saying how you should make tea. You can make tea any which way you want. But when you're trying to explain to the public how to make tea on Shabbat, there's a way to explain what's the principles, why are we doing it this way, and does it make sense to you? And if it doesn't make sense, sometimes the best thing to do is just keep quiet, or have tea essence made ahead of time so that everyone doesn't have to bother with this thing. What I'm saying is, again, drawing from Emerson's teaching, is we have to be man or woman thinking, not bookworms. We have to have a religion that stems from our own inner sense, not just what other people tell us. We have to be able to feel God from within us, not just God outside talking to us. We have to feel commandments, not just commandments from some external heteronymous source. We have to feel this makes sense to us. This enriches us. This empowers us. This makes us feel like we're better people. This is what Judaism is supposed to be, in my humble estimation. And when you study Emerson, you're studying a person who essentially is a religious person. He's a person who was a religious man. He wasn't Jewish, but he was religious. And he was looking for something that is relevant to all human beings who are searching for truth with a small t and truth with a capital T. Each of us has his and her own way of dealing with life. We each have our own memories, our own feelings, our own sensitivities. And we shouldn't be ashamed of those things. We can't just put ourselves into a box and say, this is what the tradition says, therefore we have to just do it plain and simple. We should follow the tradition. I'm an Orthodox rabbi, I believe in the tradition. But I believe the tradition has to be brought to life. I often say, if there were no such thing as synagogues, no such thing as liturgy, would we create the synagogues the way they are right now? Would we create the same liturgy? And the answer is for sure we would not. Does that mean we should throw everything away? No, not at all. Because there's something to be gained from the historical tradition. To know that my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and going back all these centuries prayed in a certain way and said a certain prayers, that gives me strength also. I hear their voices also. So we don't want to just throw away the bath with the baby with the bathwater, but we have to find a balance. And that is what I often think contemporary Judaism is lacking. On the one hand, there are people who just throw everything away. On the other hand, there are people who are just shut out truth that's from the outside, they don't incorporate what I call a cultured religion. Those are the things I have to say for today. I don't know how we're going to deal with any. If there are questions or comments, if you want to raise your hand, we could try a few questions. But let me just say the following thing. If you have particular questions and comments, you could just send them to me directly and I could answer them by email. My email is mdangel@jewishideas.org. mdangel@jewishideas.org, and I'll try to answer